Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about tropes, in particular, how we talk about tropes, and give a couple of examples of why we can be led astray when we identify a trope and immediately sort of end all discussion and thought about it. Now, before I get started on this, I am not the authority on anything. I am not the be all and end all. I'm simply trying to give my perspective on something that we all discuss. And from my point of view, the discussion of tropes, particularly online, tends to run to the superficial and tends to run to the judgmental. And part of that, I think, is, as academics are wont to talk about, a semantic element, an element of definition. And another thing is about how we generally sort of, once we've identified something, we just stop. We don't think about the context of the thing. And as I have said almost ad nauseum on this channel, context can be incredibly important. So let's start with the boring sort of definition of trope. And trope initially had a definition that was to do with the identification of figurative language, non-literal language, things like metaphors, similes, symbols, things that were abstract in their interpretation. But as time has moved on, the concept has broadened and widened, and the definition typically is used now for better or for worse to mean an identifiable narrative element. Now, when I talk about a narrative element or a narrative unit, this can be a thing, the callow youth. That is a thing, a narrative element about the young character who is naive and goes out into the world. That is a narrative element, the callow youth, and it's identifiable. It could be a particular framing or phrasing. Once upon a time, there's a trope. It signifies the beginning of a fairy tale style narrative just by using once upon a time. It's a trope. We could talk about plot movements and motions and things happening. So, for instance, enemies to lovers. That is a movement of the relationship of characters within a novel or within a narrative. And that movement is they begin as enemies and then become lovers. That is a recognizable trope. So, what we're actually talking about, it's not limited to any one type of thing, but it's always an identifiable narrative element. That's what we're discussing. Now, where my own personal opinion sort of diverges from a lot of other people is that tropes are not good or bad. There is no judgment associated with the particular trope. The reason for this, and I know there are certain tropes that people will point out, and I'm going to discuss one, that in its execution is bad and can be poorly done, and typically is poorly done. And because of that, when we see that trope, we identify and we say, this is bad writing. But part of me has a knee-jerk reaction rejecting that. And it's for a number of things. The first is what we identify now as commonplace, what we identify now as a readily identifiable trope, something that we see that is overused or used all the time, or we've just gotten tired of. That is of the now. But as we are all very well aware, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, these things may no longer be used. They may become forgotten. They may become discarded. And then 20, 30, 50 years after that, they get resurrected and they are new. They are innovative. They're being used in a new way. And suddenly, what to us today could be described as a tired and cliched and boring trope, in 100 years' time, could be rediscovered and redeployed. Similarly, things from 100 years ago that had become cliched and boring and tired are now being worked into narratives in innovative and interesting ways, simply because they had fallen out of fashion, not been used for a while, and then sort of bubbled up to the surface again. And so, because of this, because that the judgment about whether or not is good or bad or interesting can change depending on where we are and when we encounter it, that signals to me that the thing itself is not necessarily good or bad. It's how it's being used, the context in which it is being used, and our knowledge of all of these things. So the element in and of itself, personally, I think is rarely good or bad. It's about how it is used. And further, sort of along this line, one of the things that I think lends itself to this oversimplification of what tropes are into a judgmental stance is how frequently we conflate trope and cliche. And the thing is, tropes can be cliched, they can become cliched. But if you think about that for a second, the cliche bit is the thing we object to, not the trope bit. Because tropes can be, it's a newly discovered trope or a newly investigated trope or a newly popular trope, or it can become old hat and tired, in which case the trope itself, we're describing it as cliched. So trope and cliche are two different things. But when we make that sort of synonymous link between the two, oh, when I'm talking about tropes, I'm talking about cliches, we're confusing and conflating issues. And, semantic arguments are what academics love. Honestly, they give us nightmares sometimes. So when we're thinking about this, I want to think about how some tropes can structurally or narratively be almost identical. And yet we view one version of it very, very poorly, and the other version passes without notice. So if we think of the orphaned superhero, a superhero character, and take your pick, there are quite a few that fit this category, but their parents get killed off at a certain stage and they are orphaned. And that gives them the drive and the focus to become a superhero. I go, yeah, it's not instinctively bad, but we can see these characters are the parents. The characters that are the parents are being used not as characters, but as plot functions to further the hero's journey. They are giving impetus and direction to the hero. They are used solely as a function of the hero's story. That's it. That's what they are there for. They get killed off so that the hero can become a vigilante superhero. And we don't necessarily have a knee-jerk reaction going, this is absolutely terrible. This is, how dare anyone put this in? This is really bad writing. You go, no, it's a standard plot function for this. Is it particularly innovative? Not really. Is it particularly upsetting and bad and wrong? Not really. It just is. If we think of when a pet is threatened in a story, so someone comes along and hurts the pet. This happens in lots of different things, be it from a pet bunny that ends up being boiled, or in John Wick, they killed his dog. As a result of them killing his dog, the instigating event, it sets him off on a path of revenge because the death of the dog affected him deeply. They wounded him, they caused him problems, and he's going to exact revenge on them because they killed his dog. It's all framed around who John Wick is. The dog is a plot function of John Wick. The dog is not an animal character in and of itself. It is simply a plot function to give an external reason for John Wick to go on a killing spree. Otherwise, he would have stayed in retirement. And we look at that and we go, well, it's essentially the same, particularly in narrative and in functional terms, as the parents being killed off. Someone comes along, an external threat, kills something connected to the hero. The hero views this as a personal attack because something connected to them has been attacked and therefore goes on a revenge quest. The thing being attacked, be it the dog, the parent, or any sort of connection to the hero, is not a thing in and of itself. It is framed entirely as part of the hero's story. Now, there's one version of this that people get very, very upset about, and for justifiable reasons, particularly given an historical context and a narrative context in which it was appearing a lot. And that is women in refrigerators, the fridging of a female character. And in that Green Lantern story, Gail Simone wrote about this. Gail Simone came up with the term. All credit to her. But I want to talk about this because in that story, again, there is a female character, and this is a female character in a male-dominated sort of narrative field. Lots and lots of male superheroes, far fewer female superheroes. Lots and lots of male characters, far fewer female characters. And those female characters were typically wives, girlfriends, lovers, people who were being protected by the male hero. So they were almost always, or at least significantly, seen as subservient to the male hero. And in this particular issue, the Green Lantern comes home and his new wife is dead and in the fridge because his arch nemesis had come along, killed her, and stuffed her in the fridge, which sets him off on a quest for revenge. And Gail Simone pointed out how often this was occurring. And she goes into a lot greater detail about other things, but in this particular instance, and as this particular trope, that the female character was seen as very much there to service the male character's story. She wasn't given her own agency. She was a plot function for the male character. But as we've seen with the parents of superheroes or John Wick's dog, this is frequently the case in a male narrative where someone threatens something, the male hero, particularly in action adventure or action revenge, goes off to avenge this damage done to them by this other person. It's an instigating event, and they are seeking revenge. One of the reasons why this was a problem, particularly in comic book narratives, was the frequency with which it was occurring. And it's not that if your narrative is focused on a sole character, that you can't focus on their story, but you do typically have to be aware of other characters and what other characters are doing, what value they bring, and constantly treating female characters as plot servicing objects for male narratives had become and is still a problem. But fast forward now to the internet generation when we are talking about a lot of these things, and it's female character was killed. She was fridged. But that's not quite the same. And this is not to excuse the fridging of characters. I have gotten into arguments with Malazan fans when I happened to suggest that I interpreted one of the things that happened in the Malazan books as the fridging of a character. And people vehemently disagreed with me because how dare I criticize Stephen Erickson's work that way? Call them as I see them. But let's talk about season 1 of Wheel of Time, the TV show, episode 1. In that, Perrin accidentally kills his wife in the midst of a battle rage in the middle of a chaotic battle. And people said this was an element and this was an example of fridging. And I have disagreed with this, and I've disagreed with this before on this channel and elsewhere. And I still disagree with it being characterized that way, because unless we broaden the definition of fridging to be any female character death for any narrative purpose, which I think robs it of any usefulness as a term and certainly takes it away from the aspect that Simone was criticizing. Um, that's the only way I think you could describe this as fridging. If in that sequence the Trolloc had killed Layla, that I would have described as fridging, because the Trolloc would have killed Layla, and Perrin, having had his wife killed, now goes on a quest to get revenge. He goes on a quest to find and kill that Trolloc and gets caught up in Rand's story and Moraine's story and Matt's story and the whole story of the Wheel of Time. If a Trolloc had killed Layla, and that was his impetus to go and defeat the Dark One, that I would have termed as fridging. But even with that, it becomes more complicated because of the number of gynocentric stories in the Wheel of Time, particularly in the Wheel of Time TV show. But this is not just a male narrative. If it was a story about Perrin and it was Perrin's story, and he was the male protagonist, he was the male hero at the center of it, and a Trolloc killed Layla, and that was why he ended up going off on this quest to defeat the Dark One, even if later on he changed his mind and got all these other more altruistic reasons. That I would have called fridging. But what we saw in the Wheel of Time TV show was not that. It was Perrin in the midst of a chaotic battle and in the midst of a berserker battle rage, accidentally kills his wife. And because of that, suffers psychological trauma. It affects his character. It is not the reason he goes on the quest. It is not the instigating event, because the instigating event is the invasion of the Two Towers by the Trollocs. That's the thing that sets all of this in motion for the TV show. And so, whether Layla lived or died, the Trolloc invasion still happened. Perrin still would have gone on the quest. So, that is one of the differences here. The second is Perrin kills her, not someone else. This isn't an external factor to generate a storyline for the character. That's not what happened here. This is Perrin did something. And because of that, now he carries a secret and a burden, which adds psychological depth to a lot of his character arc. The third aspect of this that I think is important in this consideration is that Perrin's arc in the Wheel of Time has two major components to his character. The first is his indecision between becoming a wolf brother and embracing this animalistic and, from a certain perspective, barbaric mindset of being violent and losing himself in battle as a berserker. And that is symbolized by the choosing of the axe. That is one of the things that Perrin struggles with, and it is set opposed to being a blacksmith, being a crafter, controlling his temper, not getting involved in battle, and choosing the hammer. The issue is a lot of how Jordan explored this in the books was through internal monologue, was through a lot of the interiority of Perrin, which doesn't translate that well to the screen. So how do you communicate that effectively to a viewer? Well, you could do the lazy thing, which is have Perrin explain it to someone. That would be lazy writing. It's, I need the interiority of this character to be shown. I know, I'll have him confess to someone. That's lazy writing. That's just telling the viewer. So that could have been one way that they did this. Another way would have been to fill in backstory about he was so much bigger and stronger, and that's why he always feared hurting people. But again, how do you show that without adding in flashback sequences for something that was already compressed in terms of time? Or again, having him tell someone this, which is, as I said, that's lazy writing. So what they chose was they chose to link it to Perrin being responsible for Layla's death. Because now There is a visual and visceral reason for why he is so conflicted in a fantasy world that venerates warriors, in a fantasy world that is full of violence, where you need to be a powerful warrior or a powerful magic user of some description in order to succeed and survive, particularly when you're going up to battle these forces. Why is Perrin so reluctant to embrace these powers and these abilities? Because of his guilt over killing his wife. So it ties in the incident in a neat, concise fashion into Perrin's arc, something he will struggle with throughout the series. And it does so in a way that was visually communicated in a short space of time, i.e., concise, tight, clever writing. And that's regardless of whether or not we like it, but it was concise, tight, clever writing. It tied in a core aspect of his personality into something that was visually communicated in a matter of seconds. And that's clever. The second aspect of this, and it's something I think that is going to come up in seasons 3 and 4, is Perrin's reluctance to choose either one of the attractive women pursuing him. And this was always something that was slightly odd in the books, that Perrin struggles so much with, does this woman like me? What am I meant to do? Because they're a farming community, they're a rural community. They've seen people get married, they've seen animals. This shouldn't be complicated. He's pursued by two different women and he struggles with it. And again, unless you have a lot of that internal monologue, his interiority, and him confessing these things to people and speaking it all out loud, it's a very difficult aspect to communicate to a viewer. And so the fact that the death of Layla also explains this thing shows that the showrunners thought of the two major aspects of Perrin and found one small, short sequence that encompassed both. And like I said, I don't see it as fridging. And the reason I don't see it as fridging is not only is it not an external someone doing something to a piece of property of Perrin's, and then Perrin going on a quest to exact revenge, or going, well, now I'm going to go and do this and punish people. It was never framed in that way because A, Perrin does it. B, it's not the instigating event for his entire character arc and journey. It's an explanation for why later on he is reticent to choose the hero's path, or to choose the warrior's path, or to become a wolf brother, or to choose between Phil and, oh, I forgot her other name. But it's not quite the same as the way that the fridging was described. Layla is not an appendage of Perrin's that someone else had damaged, that he must now go and seek restitution for. Yes, she was still being used as a plot function in exactly the same way that all characters are plot functions. They are. As much as we like to think of characters as real people, as much as we like to try and imagine the depth to them, characters at their heart are still plot functions. They are still elements of narrative. They serve a narrative purpose, no matter how pretty and how apparently deep authors and writers make them. They are still not real. They are still functions within the narrative. And because of that, and because that this particular TV show has a number of gynocentric storylines, that is focusing on gynocentric storylines, and has at its heart a deep consideration of agency and female autonomy. I think the accusations of fridging looked at the superficial nature of, oh, she died because Perrin, and overlooked a lot of the context that makes fridging a bad trope, or a trope that we want to avoid. And further along with this, When we think of the number of times, well, one of the suggestions that had been made was, well, if the blacksmith master had been there and Perrin had killed him instead, what is the distinction and difference we are making here then? It's okay to kill the male character, but for some reason, the killing of the female character is entirely different. They'd still be serving essentially the same narrative function, but we're okay with one and not the other for reasons. And we can look back at the long history of the depictions of violence against women in narrative to say there's the reasons for it. But in a show that is already addressing all of those things, I think finding or setting this scene in balance with and in context of the rest of the sequence is actually quite important. I know that not everyone agrees with me on this. I'm fine with that. But this is one where I think there is actually a significant difference, not only in the type, not only in the expression, not only in the intention, and not only in the execution, but in all of it together, which for me is enough to distinguish it from the women in refrigerators trope. It might not be for you, which is absolutely fine. But when we start thinking in terms of narrative function, we stop looking at it and going, I see this trope, or I see these elements which correspond to that trope, and that trope is bad. We start thinking about it in a narrative context, how it is being used, why is it being used, what does it achieve? And these different elements can be very, very important. And that brings me back to this whole first thing that I was talking about in terms of tropes and how we talk about it, how we approach it. It's not just the thing, it is how the thing is being used. One of the analogies I often use is that tropes are like chords in music. And there was a comedy band called Axis of Awesome that did the 4 chord song, where they did a medley of all of these quite, some of them very, very famous songs that use the same 4 chords. And when you listen to it, they move seamlessly from one song to the next, all using the same chords. But what's interesting about this is that even when you listen to the individual songs and you can sense similarities, you wouldn't say, oh, that song is chordy. No, you wouldn't do that. You also wouldn't say that these two songs are the same. You go, no, they're using similar elements, or they're using the same elements in slightly different ways to slightly different effects to achieve different things. And that's what I think is part of what's missing in the conversation and discussion of tropes. We have become so used to going, this is a trope, it has this definition, this is the thing, and that is it. And we start using it as a concrete little tiny box, a label that can identify something, and that's all that we need to do. And yet, context is incredibly important in narrative. How something is deployed, how it is used, in what sense is it being used. All of these elements are important in the discussion of tropes, because tropes are not cliches. Some tropes can be cliches or can be cliched, but not all tropes are cliches. Not all cliches are tropes. How they're being used is important. What they're being used for is important. The context of everything is important. And that's basically all I wanted to say on this. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.